Crud kind of part 2 for applicators specifically. And I try to include some of the rates and costs, but if you guys have specific questions on that, I'm happy to address those. All right, so for those of you who were not with me yesterday, I'm Alison Herrell. I'm an arborologist for Rainbow Tree Care Scientific Advancements. This is a made-up job title, but basically I'm an arborist, and I help do a lot of hands-on training and research and development for products and protocols in the plant healthcare and landscape industries. So I work with a lot of municipalities as well as private tree care companies out there. I am based out of the Pacific Northwest. I'm in Portland, but I support the entire West Coast as well as the Rocky Mountain territories. Some of you may know my colleague, Tony Smith. I actually think she's on this. So if you've worked with her, she's my colleague, and the two of us work together to support all of you. So please feel free to reach out to us. My info is there, and I'll show it at the end as well. Just like a quick background of how, you know, who we are, Rainbow, just so you guys know. We're a tree care company based out of Minneapolis, but the scientific advancements, SciVance side of things, we work all over the country. So there's about 30 of us nationwide. We all work remote, even before COVID. And basically, we are founded in science. We run a bunch of research and development trials in-house, as well as with industry academic partners, including Dr. Hauer. And many, many others out there. We develop protocols, products in order to get predictable results for your clients and for your cities. We do a ton of training, and we have a full technical support team. So we actually have a tech support line if you guys ever have questions with identification or chemical rates and things. And then we also help small companies or any companies create sort of marketing material for customers and residents. Okay, so quickly on the agenda, we're going to review the IPM and PHC toolbox approach that I did go over yesterday, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about a couple of things there. And then here was kind of the laundry list that I was given to discuss. So ash flower gall mites, emerald ash borer, spruce budworm, Doug fir tussock moth, cytost for canker, and plant growth regulators. So again, focus here is going to be on EAB and PGRs for the majority of this time, but I will touch on a few other things, and if you guys have other questions, feel free. So, reminder, integrated pest management, you guys should all remember this from your PHC or your pesticide applicator exams. Sustainable, science-based decision-making. You got to look at your biological, cultural, physical, and chemical tools to manage and reduce risks from pest and pest management tools. So we're looking at overall economic, health, and environmental risks, taking all of these things into consideration. And then, so what integrated pest management means is using a toolbox approach. So diagnosing your problems properly, reviewing your cultural and chemical control options, and determining the best application technique given the pest and pathogen. You're not using the same thing for every problem. Every site is different. And then this gets translated over into arboriculture for, as we call it, right, plant healthcare. So first and foremost, our cultural options. I do think they get grazed over, even though we all know these, right? So when you're looking at diagnostics and trying to solve problems, watering, pruning, mulching, reducing soil compaction and girdling roots, prescription fertilizers, and then I'll talk about plant growth regulators, but that's also a great tool. And then kind of what we just heard about too is planting the right tree in the right place, just like preemptively looking at problems before they become problems, because then we don't even have to intervene with chemical management if we're just doing the right things to begin with. When we get to tree care application techniques, we have quite a few. We've got our systemics, our tree injections, both micro and macro, soil applications in the form of a drench or an injection into the soil, or a basal bark spray. I'll show a couple pictures. And then our non-systemic, those are our contacts, those are our foliar sprays and trunk and limb sprays. And then I did get a question on what to charge. So I'll kind of just briefly touch on that. So spray applications, those are our trunk and limb sprays as well as our foliar sprays. As far as charging, generally industry-wide, your minimum just to show up and spray a tree is about $100, depending on where you are. A little bit lower if you've kind of got like a higher volume, or maybe it's like close to your shop. And this is for residential arborists. And then you kind of add the time and material based on what you've got. So some arborists will add like $5 to $25 roughly, depending on tree size and what chemical you're using, obviously, because some products are much more expensive than others. You're talking about like acetyloprin sprays. We joke in the industry that's like rubbing two blocks of gold together and then putting it in your tank. So that may be more expensive. And then basil bark sprays, that's where you just kind of use the wand to get the trunk of the tree wet. That is a bit of a cheaper option typically, but again, this is systemic, so different mode of action, but about $5 to $10 diameter inch, depending on rate and chemical. And then the one thing I will note here too is these are both extremely cheap options to use. So if you're like municipalities bringing this in-house, to you, the cost is very low for both of these. So like, less than a couple dollars per diameter inch for a basil bark spray, even with a sort of expensive chemical. And then again, only usually like a few dollars per 100-gallon tank for your foliar spray. So relatively cost effective, especially if you're doing it in-house. The costs that I talk about charging at the bottom are really if you're like the cost to show up on site and do those applications, plus your equipment, plus your chemical cost. Soil applications, you've got that soil drench and that soil injection. Those can be really cheap depending on the product. So like your insecticides, you may be on that lower end of like $5 to $10 per diameter inch. But then something like your plant growth regulators, that may be closer to like $20 a diameter inch. But again, like pretty easy applications. Tree injection, our macro, that's like what we use for Dutch elm disease, which we talked about yesterday. That pricing can be a bit more expensive just because you're putting such a large volume of water in. So I think industry-wide, generally charging between about $12 and $20 a diameter inch. Again, depending on, there's other chemicals you could be using, as well as what the site looks like, stuff like that. Micro injection charging between 5 and 16, again, depending on the product that you're using and the rates that you're using. But as we'll talk about with EAB, it's much closer to that lower end, even as Rich was talking about earlier, some of those contracts coming in at $4 or $5 an inch, which is crazy. So just the quick difference between micro and macro. Micro, you're looking at your insecticides. Those will translocate through the tree, so you're not worried about getting specific coverage to the entire vascular tissue. Macro injection, you need to make sure you're getting really good even distribution, higher volume of water to cover basically the biology of the pests that are impacted by using those fungicides. Okay, so since I have my applicators here, we would be in poor form to not talk about PPE and safety. So typically your PPE and safety for chemical applications includes long pants, long sleeve shirt, chemical resistant gloves, so not just regular gloves, but your true chemical resistant gloves, shoes and socks, and wraparound safety glasses. In some circumstances, you should also be carrying a hard hat. So if you're gonna be like near a lot of brush, or have a lot of overhead spray drift, a face shield. Again, if you're gonna have spray drift, which hopefully you're not, but it's kind of inevitable, unfortunately. Apron, there are some products that require that for mixing. An approved respirator if you're dealing with dust particles. Rubber boots or over boots, reflective vests, and cones for your traffic issues. Read the label. The label is the law. And I just put up 2 labels really quick of ours. They're literally right on there, right? They tell you exactly what you need. And bonus picture, because you look super cool wearing PPE. That's me, obviously. So yeah, just follow the label. The reason they exist is to keep you guys safe. So please do that. All right, so we'll get into some of the pests. I was asked to cover ash flower gall mites, which is very funny. So it's fine. It's just funny because we get a lot of questions on these, but then there's not really anything that we do for them. So your hosts are your ash species, and important to note, it's only on your male trees. So ash trees are dioecious, so male and female trees. your male have flower parts, your female have flower and fruiting parts, but only the male trees exhibit this. It's an aerophyte mite that you typically can't see unless you're looking under like a lens or a microscope. They're really little. And then what happens is they go into this flower, and then they form these galls. So in the spring, they are like that greenish color on the top, which you'll see, and people don't really think anything of it because they think it's just like the way the flower looks. But then in the fall, they turn brown, and it can be pretty like gross looking. So I understand why people are concerned, but it's mostly an aesthetic disorder. They're not known to cause damage or negatively impact the overall vigor of ash trees. So if someone was super concerned, you could prune them out. You could use dormant oils to reduce the mite populations. You could spray with a miticide, and that would be at flower bud break. But typically, nature is what it is, and that's what it's going to look like. So nothing to worry about. But again, you will see this a lot. So certainly interesting to discuss. All right. Now, we heard a lot about emerald ash borer, but we will talk about it more. So one quick slide on the biology. I feel like everybody knows these things, but also whatever. Here's a little reminder. So our Agralis planopennis hosts our ash trees. Biology, it is a green, shiny beetle, flat-headed borer, attacks all ash regardless of health. So like we just heard, normal Agralis species will go after your weakened trees. These will go after anything, even if they're healthy. They lay eggs on the bark, the eggs hatch, the larvae feed through the vascular tissue, they pupate into adults, emerge in those D-shaped exit holes, and then go to the next tree. Signs and symptoms are many. Those D-shaped exit holes, but they are small. S-shaped galleries in the cambium, woodpecker activity, epicormic shoots, crown thinning, dieback, and eventual death. So you kind of see the pictures on the right. Those are really classic signs and symptoms. So practical concerns, I did want to touch on this. When it goes into planning, it's hard. There's just a lot of issues that we need to take into consideration. So obviously economics, when you're looking at the cost for treating versus removal, that's a huge discussion to have around your budgets, whether you're a homeowner or a municipality. Your environmental things, obviously tons of ecosystem benefits. Yesterday, Gordon was talking about all of those. So keeping those in mind. Public safety, of course, if those trees come down on someone, you've got quite the liability on your hands. I know that in Chicago, so I used to work in Chicago, which is why I'm so closely involved with emerald ash borer. There was a couple ash trees that had pretty large limbs come down and actually injure a few people, and that ends up being kind of a big to do, right? We want to avoid that. Your political side of things, right? Who pays for what? And also this side of it is interesting. Obviously we talk about removal or replacement, but removals, yeah, they're like cost effective, right? We just saw that in the graph, but there's a lot of sort of like public outcry when you remove hundreds of thousands or whatever ash trees. So I was on a contract in the city of Chicago where I was on the removal project for just one of the parks, and we removed 11,000 ash trees in one season. And the amount of people who were just so upset about this, who had, they had no say in it, right? It was a big city, way over their heads for getting a chance to vote on it or whatever, but it's huge, right? And then you go to this park and there's no trees. It's wild. So that's certainly something that you should consider that, whatever, you may not have thought of. Homeowner, your benefits, your shade, your property value, all of that. And then of course, public health, which again, Gordon talked about that quite a bit yesterday. But really good health benefits to having trees, air is great to breathe. And it's actually, there's been a study done by Donovan, posted this study in the American Journal of Preventative Medicine. And basically it was talking about how he believes that the loss of the 100 million plus ash trees in our canopy has actually been contributing to a lot of cardiovascular and respiratory related deaths. So removing canopies without replacing, or even if you do replace, it certainly has impacts. Okay, Spent longer on that than I wanted to. But so we just looked at this, the exponential death curve. Again, Deb McCullough out of Michigan State, who's done a ton of work with this. But we just talked about this. In the first few years, you don't notice, right? You don't see any mortality. You don't necessarily see anything. But then by that maybe third or fourth year, you start to find the beetles. And then after that, you start to notice mortality and dieback. So it takes a little while, but then once it builds, once that population builds, your mortality goes up quickly. So low pressure symptoms slow to show up, high pressure, rapid tree death. And so this is I think this is Fort Wayne, Indiana, my husband's hometown. Just in a matter of years, it goes from a perfectly healthy looking canopy to completely dead. And it's because the emerald ash borer is in there. It's probably, the larvae are probably going through those galleries, but it looks fine. And then over the course of the next 2 years, it completely girdles those trees and they are dead. So being proactive is crucial. You've got a variety of treatment options at the beginning, and then, it kind of starts to fade off. So you really need to take matters into your own hands and get your actions in place. I will say really quickly, Rainbow is going to be working with people like Dr. Hauer, as well as quite a lot of cities out here on the West Coast for EAB preventative action plans. Like we just heard, like there's a ton of stuff that already exists, so you guys don't have to reinvent the wheel. But we'll be rolling that out in the spring. So if you guys want to sit in on that, I think that could be pretty useful. We'll talk about what you need as far as inventorying and how to kind of get prepared in addition to what I'm talking about right now. Okay, what trees should you treat? You're going to have to determine that for yourselves, but typically the things that come to top of mind are mature trees, trees that deliver the most benefits, trees that are in prominent, important locations or have historical value, where removal is inefficient. So like we just heard, like these get super brittle, you cannot climb them. Climbers are have been severely injured climbing dying or dead ash trees because they get so brittle. So preserving those trees that are in spots that you can't get to is a great option. Of course, there's urban canopy initiatives. And then also that staging for removal is nice. So you could treat some trees knowing that you're not going to treat them later, but like we just heard, to kind of flatten out the curve so you don't totally overrun your tree crews. Okay, so this is a big question that I get from everyone out west. When should I start treatments? And the general rule of thumb is when the infestation is 15 miles away is when you should start doing your kind of preventative treatments. Of course, that's difficult because there's a lot of outliers, especially with infested wood being moved around, which is kind of what we saw in the Denver area. So I'm going to show you a couple of toolbox options that you should consider. But general rule of thumb, you guys aren't ready to treat quite yet. Don't put, don't put a cast on your arm if you have a broken leg, right? So you need to be kind of on the lookout and being really mindful of this and getting your plans into action, but treatments don't need to happen quite yet. Okay, so your toolbox approach, we did just see all of these. And the reason I bring this up is basically because everything has its pros and cons. So I'm just listing up at the top. We do have two soil or trunk application methods that work for smaller trees, so generally under 25 inches in diameter. That's our dinotuffurin and imidacloprid, and they show great results. This is kind of industry standard. They show great results on those smaller trees. It's nice because you don't have to drill into the tree, which I'll talk about in a bit. But of course they are neonics, which do carry some, public safety or public eye sort of issues. And then we have emmectin benzoate, basically any tree that's big enough to inject, we say kind of 6 inches. And that's super, super effective when we've got moderate to high emerald ash borer pressure, versus those soil applications are really great when you've got sort of low pressure. So you could, and because those top two are cheaper than the injection option. So it's kind of why I bring that up. Imidacloprid dinotefuran can be applied in a couple of different ways. And I bring this is really important. So when you're an applicator, and it's interesting because I've been a plant healthcare applicator for over a decade at this point, and you know about the chemistry, but you don't know about the chemistry. So this is why I bring this up. Imidacloprid has really slow uptake time comparatively. So when you do it as a soil injection, it can take up to 120 days to make it all the way to the tips of the canopy. So you need to really be mindful of that, looking at the life cycle of the pest that you're dealing with. Putting that in the ground in April, if pest emergence is in May, isn't going to do anything. You need to get that in early in the season, you know, especially in the case of emerald ash borer, to get the max amount of product into the tree as those beetles are feeding. And then dinotefuran has faster uptake. It only takes about, you know, a week to get up into the tree, but then it has a shorter amount of residual. So you wouldn't want to put it in too soon because the residual will wane off. And then emectin benzoate is great. Trunk injection is great because it gets up very quickly and it has 2 full seasons of control. So these are kind of why we talk about these things. Let me know if you guys have specific questions. There's just kind of a thing of the treatment timing, exactly what I alluded to. You want peak amounts of insecticide in the xylem of the tree when the eggs hatch, when the larvae start to feed, right? So Zytect, you do need to do either in the late fall or very early spring. Mectinite, you can do all of the growing season. Transtect, you want to hit in kind of May-ish as emergence happen. And you would not want to apply that in fall because by the time it would peak residual, it would be gone by the time the next spring would come, right? So we see no efficacy with that. So this is just kind of why I bring this up. They're not all created equal. So kind of like what Dr. Howard just talked about, the good news about all of this is that we have learned, right? So the West Coast, Montana, even Colorado, everywhere is great. So I'm going to rewind. I missed this when I introduced myself. So I am from the Midwest. I'm actually from Wisconsin. But I went to school in Indiana. I did my master's actually around emerald ash borer and management in Indiana as well. And then I started on tree crew and so doing ash removals and ash injections in Chicago for care of trees right as this all was happening about 10 years ago. So I saw it all through the first iterations of chemicals, scientists not knowing what was going on, having no data, through now where we have a ton of data and a ton of information. So that's amazing for you guys to get your plans in action. So then back then, 2010, really large lack of consensus among scientists. They were doing research, but they didn't have enough data to confidently say like what was going to work long-term, whatever. Now we have a full-fledged coalition for urban ash tree conservation. This is like multi-states, university extensions, university professors, all sorts of stuff to get that management statement in action. People didn't even really know what EAB was, but now every arborist knows what emerald ash borer is, hopefully. And then of course we had no long-term data, but now we have almost 20 years of data. So, and still learning. Also, best management practices for tree injection didn't really exist. We noticed this because we were seeing a lot of problems with injections. So bids had a wide ranges in prices, dosage rates were not correct, timing wasn't specified, application procedures were not specified. There weren't requirements for contractors to map or use GPS to locate trees. So in 2015, ISA put a tree injection BMP, and actually just for you municipalities, this includes a whole host of a big section for municipal bid specs. So this is actually a super helpful tool. I'm actually helping edit the next version. So anyway, use this tool. It's really great. We have our ANSI standards, our best management practice standards, our ISA standards for a reason. Use them. All right, another thing, products and equipment, we were super limited. We pretty much only had one system. It was a plug system with super high pressure. I saw a ton of issues as an applicator because setting the plugs was really difficult to get right. You would blow the bark if it was too shallow. It would take forever to go in if it was too deep. Obviously the product had efficacy, but we saw a lot of vascular damage. And then the thing to recognize is you're treating every other year. It's year after year after year. By like by the time I was treating in last tree that I treated in Chicago was this year. That's like their 6th injection or whatever. So you can imagine going to the bottom of the root flare and seeing that there's just like a ton of damage on the bottom. So now we do have plugless equipment that doesn't require a plug. There's smaller drill holes, lower pressure. So we're just doing a better job like coming up with solutions to protect our trees. Not only obviously want to keep them alive, but then we don't want to girdle the bottoms of the trees by doing these injections. So keeping that in mind. And then also with our product even, so even our ivermectin benzoate, the first iteration of this was super high viscosity. So 38.4, that's almost the same as maple syrup. It was oil-based and had really slow uptake. It also had warning labels. There's like stories of people being blinded by it. So it was not super awesome to use. But now we've kind of changed our chemical formulations. And I don't even just mean Rainbow, I mean as an industry. So we've got lower viscosity, water-based products, faster uptake, and safer for your applicators. So all great things for you and us. Okay, cool. So just treatment-wise, the industry standard, as you guys get to it, as the populations start to become around where you are, trunk injection of ivermectin benzoate 4% during the growing season is kind of the best management practice for trees larger than 25 inches. Recommended for areas where EAB pressure is high, or where you can't do soil application or trunk spray, or where you want to use this formulation over a neonic. 99% plus effective if applied properly using microinjection every 2 years, and that's what the label states. I'll make a statement as well. That is what you would want to stick to with your homeowner trees. You would not want to promise a homeowner that the tree will be alive and great on 2 or on 3, 4, or 5 year cycles. Just the 2-year cycle is going to be what you want to recommend to homeowners. If you're a municipality, you can talk about looking at budget structures for 3 years, 4 years, or if you're doing more of a like pushing it out to flatten the curve for removals, you know, you could do more like 5 years, what Dr. Hauer said. But your end goal would potentially include removals if you're going to spread them out that wide. There's a lot of articles that are out there. I know that Cliff Sadoff out of Purdue has published quite a bit on this as well. If you want to dig into that, or if you guys want to email me, I can send you some stuff. Also, I work with municipalities all the time to kind of set these programs up. So feel free to reach out if you have questions specifically. You can treat trees with success as long as they show less than 30% canopy dieback. So that is your threshold when you're looking at a tree. If it's got 30% dieback or less, you can treat it. If it's more, it needs to be removed. You won't be able to save it with a treatment. And then use toolbox approach when you can to prevent unnecessary wounding from injections. And this is a good point to the last question that came up in the last presentation. So the question was, when do we have to treat? Do we have to keep treating forever? And we don't know that yet, but what we are finding in some of the areas, exactly what we just heard, trees are either treated or they're dead. And there's not really a lot in between. The populations of EAB then wane off. The only problem that we are seeing is we're seeing small spikes in EAB populations in these areas because of scrub trees. So like you're kind of like ditch trees that are unmanaged, also stump sprouts. So as trees that didn't have their stumps ground out, resprout, emerald ash borer is able to reinfect those as they get large enough. So if we can manage those things, we could potentially say like, yeah, you'll never have to treat again. But unfortunately, we're kind of at a state where you could spread out the treatments, or you could switch to like an annual soil application eventually once your population kind of falls out. So that's my answer on that question. All right, so that is all I have on emerald ash borer for right now. Let me know if there's anything else you want me to cover. So we'll get into a few more laundry list pests. So western spruce budworm impacts our firs and spruces. Diagnosis, basically, you can see these larvae. They're like pretty prolific. Budworm larvae feed on the needles in spring. They cause extensive defoliation, browning of the needles and sparse foliage, especially at the top. So you'll get to these sort of like spruce areas and all the tops will just be gone. So as far as treatment options, unfortunately, it's
a bit tough, especially in those forested landscapes. Like, I mean, I know where I am, there's just like vast quantities of spruce and fir, right? So in forested landscapes, there are quite a few silvicultural practices. So like thinning works because they can't get to the next tree if there's enough space. And then this is less exciting, but aerial sprays can be used. So aerial insecticide sprays. I know that they've used like BT and spinosad. So some of our other sort of more organic friendly options to manage these things in the forested landscapes. For individual trees, so for homeowners, less likely to see this unless there's kind of like clumped together trees, right? But you could do foliar application of your contact insecticide. A great option for this is actually, I would say my preferable option for this would be a soil injection of acephate. We have a product called Lepitect. So it works on all Lepidoptera, so all of our caterpillar species, Lepidoptera caterpillars. Soil injected, can be soil applied into the ground early spring prior to emergence, and that works pretty well, and it's pretty eco-friendly. The other option is tree injection, amectin benzoate. So the thing we talked about for emerald ash borer also works on this. But obviously, I don't know if you know this, but injecting your conifers is kind of a nightmare. So there are options, but that's what we've got. Doug, for tussock moth, impacts, hosts, Douglas fir, and sometimes other true firs and some spruces. Diagnostics, you can see these too, and they're actually like very cute, right? I love tussock moth caterpillars. I think they're adorable. But they feed on the foliage. They cause them to shrivel and turn reddish brown. Again, upper canopy defoliation occurs first, but then severe defoliation happens. You'll just see totally brown trees. And then obviously this leads to stress-induced anything, right? If you're not producing energy, it's hard. So beetles come in, and then death is kind of the end game. So treatment, again, similar to the last forested landscape, silvicultural practices for thinning, aerial sprays. And then on individual trees, you can do your sprays, soil injection, or a trunk injection of amectin benzoate. So both of those are managed similarly, but yet somehow tough to manage, because typically you're looking at those like larger landscapes, and it, you know, with many of these trees, and you know, the cost is certainly something to keep in mind, because I don't know a lot of homeowners who are like, yeah, treat this like huge area of like 50 Doug firs on my property or whatever. So there are options, but these are tough. Okay, Cytospora canker. Hosts, blue spruce, sometimes other spruce species. Diagnostics, typically you'll see browning of an entire limb. These usually start lower in the canopy and then move up over time. The dieback of those entire limbs can be seen year round. And then you also see, so picture on the bottom right, that sort of white blue sap oozing from the infected branches. And those are like little lesions, and they're typically closer to the trunk. When you are diagnosing this, make sure you differentiate this from mite damage and needle casts. Mites, the trick is you shake the tree over a white piece of paper, and typically they will fall out and you will see them on your paper. Needle casts, you can typically see actual physical spores, like little dots, depending on the type of needle cast. But typically you will see something. Also, send in a sample if you aren't sure. Treatment, if you can prune out the cankers, if you catch it, you know, kind of early enough, that is an option. So it's tough, but possible. Of course, your cultural practices here, because this really impacts stressed trees. So the healthier you can keep your tree, the better off you are. And then actually soil application of paclobutrazole. So this is a plant growth regulator, which I'm about to really dive into here, every 3 years. And I will show you the data on that one. So Gary Watson did a bunch of cytospora, canker, and apple scab studies with paclobutrazol. He's out of the Morton Arboretum. Anyway, so look at this table. The top is not treated, so severity of cytospora canker in your blue spruce up on the top, and then on the bottom were 2 different rates of paclo that were used, and we actually saw very good suppression. And actually, this table is funny because the 4-gram rate is actually the label rate, and the 8-gram rate they were just doing for the fun of science, and the 4-gram rate performed better. So you don't even need to use the proper label rate. You don't even need to use more to get better efficacy. So that's great. So that leads me directly into plant growth regulators. Yeah, good on time. Okay, so I don't want to make this like a commercial for me or any of our things, but I'm going to be talking about paclobutrazol specifically. All the photos and the research are ours. So RTSA is responsible for the creation, the labeling, all of that of Cambistat and Trimtect. So Cambistat is our soil drench or soil injection for trees. Trimtect is our foliar application for shrubs. There are other formulations of paclobutrazol and other trade names out there, but for the sake of actual science and data, I just want to be clear that these are our things. And I'll refer to it as Paclo from here on out. So, history of plant growth regulators, introduced to the floricultural industry to create uniform plants. So this is not a new thing to the landscape. This has been going on for decades. And look how cute and nice they look, right? They keep them nice and compact, they save space, and they look great. So the first generation of plant growth regulators are, we call them type 1 PGRs. They stop mitosis. So there's one called like Atramec. I think it's pretty well used out there. Anyway, so they stop mitosis, but the problem that we saw with this formulation is that they can cause some distortion in your plants. So if you look on the bottom, obviously it's not growing as much. You see how small those leaves are, but then they kind of like got some yellowing and distortion. So that kind of led to type 2 plant growth regulators, which basically reduce the elongation of the meristematic tissue, which I'll show you on the next slide. But if you just look really quick on this oak on the right, 1 year of untreated growth, that's how much it put out in a year versus 1 year of treated growth. So you saw quite a bit of growth reduction there. All right, so how it works is it reduces gibberellic acid, which is your cell elongation hormone. This results in less elongation and enlargement of new tissue, and then that frees up some of the other elements to create more chlorophyll. So that's kind of the first change. And then the second is that it increases abscisic acid. So that's our plant protection hormone. So that in turn will stimulate root growth, trigger the closing of stomata to keep up with transpiration, protect cells from dehydration. So basically they respond better in drought stress, and then stimulates phytodefense compounds. Cool. So this is just like a visual difference of how it should look. So regular untreated on the left, type 1, you saw some distortion and yellowing. On the right, you see smaller, more compact leaves, but you do see a green up, and part of that is because of that chlorophyll increase. So Dan Herms put this together, and I love using this because it makes so much sense to me. But plants have a finite amount of energy, and they use them for 5 things: vegetation and shoot growth, reproductive structures, root growth, defense compounds, and storage compounds, right? So if you look at the black, that's how much energy roughly they're putting into it. So if you notice on the left, a ton goes into vegetation growth, shoot growth. So when you treat a plant with paclobutrazol, it changes the way their hormones are working. And what it does is reduces the amount of shoot growth and then frees up those elements to go into the other, other buckets, if you will. So that's what we love about it. Paclo has a lot of great uses and opportunities. So this is for both municipalities as well as your regular residential commercial arborists. Growth reduction, of course, that's the whole first and foremost purpose of it. Construction damage, drought tolerance, fibrous root growth, chlorotic trees, disease resistance, and declining trees. And I'm gonna try to breeze through. Okay, so obviously growth reduction has its benefits. I took this picture on the right. We deal with this all the time. trees are getting close to the houses or buildings and blocking signs and things. And people are like, just trim it away. But pruning a tree away from a house year after year after year, not really great for the trees. So one treatment of Paclo, soil applied for trees, reduces the growth rate of trees between 40 to 60% for 3 years. So it's a once every 3-year application. City of Milwaukee, my hometown, did a little side-by-side study here. And the reason that we did this is because these folks were getting complaints about signage being blocked and getting too close to their awnings and buildings. And you can see pretty clearly right here, the treated tree is looking a lot better in that space than the untreated tree. And then this kind of goes into that discussion around like, why are these trees even planted here anyway? But if we can keep them a little bit smaller and improve the vigor, that'll actually allow them to survive longer in those cutouts, even though we shouldn't put them there anyway, but we do. So if we can increase that time that they're there, that's great from a budgetary standpoint. Just like to see the side-by-side of growth. We saw almost 60% growth reduction in red oaks. Oaks do great, respond great to Paclo. So this is, I'm just going to show you shrubs. This is a little bit more used in our landscape industry. So people who do landscape maintenance contracts where you have to go and shear plants over and over and over again. This allows you to not do that. Basically, one foliar applied treatment reduces the growth rate between 30 to 70%, and it lasts for roughly 10 weeks, 8 to 12 weeks, depends on the plant species, timing, pruning, soil type, growing conditions, etc. This is a great photo. Winged euonymus, sheared in January, we let it flush out, then sprayed it in May. And then this photo was taken at the end of June, and you see on the left how much growth it got in a normal growing season versus on the right, it kept them pretty nice and compact, nothing too crazy, really nice for a landscape maintenance thing. It would be cool for you commercial arborists who have like really high-end accounts potentially to bring in. But generally speaking, I don't know. I couldn't speak to the cost benefit for the smaller usages, but for big usages, this actually saves a ton of labor and time. And it looks really nice. So I like this purple coneflower picture because it makes it nice and compact and looks really green and lovely. Okay, so benefits of growth management for utilities. This is actually a huge part of what I work on. Our company works on, but basically it reduces the frequency for pruning, extends pruning cycles, reduces your mid-cycle pruning, and reduces the cost of utility line clearance pruning. So especially out here where we are in fire land, this is hugely important just because I know that quite a few electric, trees touching wires is not a good thing. That can definitely lead to fires and other issues, which we definitely want to avoid. But then of course, like from a safety perspective, right? Anybody who is out there working for any of these trimming contracts, I hate getting close to lines. It's super scary. So the more we can keep our folks away from these high voltage wires, the better off we are. Also, reduced diameter growth. This is great for our municipality folks. You can see the rings, right? So the thickness of the trunk is much smaller in the treated versus the untreated. And this is why this is important, because we see a lot of trees like this in grates. I was in Seattle a couple of weeks ago, and literally, 100 trees were being girdled by the grates. So this is kind of a way to keep your diameter of your trunk smaller and help delay that. Also, just if we could not plant trees like this, that would be awesome. Okay, alleviate construction damage. We talked about this yesterday a little, I think. Anyway, so we did a root recovery trial with Bartlett, basically where we simulated doing construction damage. So we went in with our stumpers, we drove a bunch of equipment over it, we cut a bunch of roots, and just try to simulate what it would look like to see how things would go. So these are the photos that we ended up with. Treated on the left, untreated on the right. So that was only 1 year, and typically you don't see dieback from construction so quickly, but you can clearly tell on the right, it took an impact on that tree pretty quickly. And then again, we did treated fertilizer and mulch on the left versus only Paclo on the right. And it's hard to tell in the picture in this little of a screen and brightness, but it actually does look significantly better. So it's pretty cool. Greater drought protection, I know that can be huge. Stomata are closed due to higher concentration of abscisic acid, slowed movement of gases and water through the stomata. So basically, just improved drought protection. And here is a little data. Dr. Percival did this. But basically, we made oaks droughty on purpose, and 80% of them died if we made them droughty enough. With the low rate and high rates, both rates of paclobutrazol, they all lived. And then we saw much lower leaf necrosis, way higher chlorophyll content. So that's huge. That's a great way for you to get your oaks. Like I said, oaks are super responsive to this. They respond really well. So that's a great way to start thinking about uses for droughty when you've got droughty areas or you have a poor potential to water properly. Trees have less scorch. This is the exact same concept. You can see the visible differences here. And I know that in Colorado, they've been doing a ton of studies on this and looking at a lot of pictures. So that's pretty close to, you know, some of those dry conditions that you'll get out there. I like this. This is the microscopy photos. You can actually see the thicker leaves, yikes, and better moisture retention during your hot, dry periods. So if you look these pictures, the thicker leaf surface and increased protective hairs, that's like a visible difference under the microscope. And then these are the trichome hairs here. So on the right, you see a lot more versus on the left, not. So both trichome hairs and thick leaf cuticles are helpful in drought resistance. All right, like I said, it increases chlorophyll production, so trees are naturally going to be less chlorotic, right? Because chlorosis literally is a tree that can't produce enough chlorophyll. Great photo right here, looks amazing. Super thick, glossy, green leaves. I actually just looked at this one a couple years ago. This is out east, this is at Villanova, but these are pin oaks, and the one on the left we treated a couple years ago, and the one on the right we treated, left we didn't. And just drastically different how yellow that one on the left looks versus the right. And that's gonna turn around that whole ability for that tree, like we talked about yesterday, to increase its root system, its rhizosphere, as well as, you know, its upper canopy. So you're kind of turning that tree around for the long haul versus the left will just continue to die. It increases your root mass. And basically, of course, roots are so it's fine roots, not your big ones. It increases the amount of those fine roots that are responsible for absorbing nutrients and water. All right, there's just another photo. So, okay, what I want to mention on this is a ponderosa pine, which is great because you guys have a lot of those. The one thing to note is with paclobutrazol, you don't see good regulation. So the growth regulation is not very good on your conifer species. So like, don't try using this on your arborvitaes, your spruce, your pines, anything like that in order if you want to make them smaller or stay small. But the side benefits are huge. So as we already talked about cytosis per canker, we see really good suppression by using this. Your pines, you're not going to see good growth reduction, but you will see really good increased fibrous roots. So just setting that expectation for yourselves and your clients is important. So really good benefits, but less growth regulation on your conifers. And then I do want to point out, again, we've got a best management practice for root management here. This is ANSI standard, use these. But basically this root management guide tells you Paclo can increase the weight of regenerated roots in some species. So not all, but many that we found. And then kind of touching back to our discussion around chlorosis yesterday. So this photo is really interesting because you see this chlorotic tree right in front, and then two trees of the exact same species that share the same sort of soil area, et cetera, that are perfectly green and fine. So it's not like a lack of nutrients in the soil. It's not, it doesn't appear that it's some sort of cultural or environmental issue. Most likely this is just because the rhizosphere, the root rhizosphere of this tree is not as strong. So when they looked into this a little bit more, they found out that these chlorotic trees had fewer roots. The green trees had well-established roots and they were more abundant than the chlorotic trees. So that kind of led us to think if we can improve those roots, we can improve chlorosis as well as increasing the amount of chlorophyll by using Paclo. Greater disease resistance. So I don't like this chart because I think it's hard to understand, but basically phenylpropanoid indicates the plant's ability to defend itself. So less shoot growth, more phenylpropanoid. So that's, if you reduce the amount of growth, the higher defense compounds. Cool. Which brings me into the next thing. Some of our foliar fungus aesthetic issues that we deal with. So like, I don't think you don't, but where Dr. Hauer is from, you guys have plenty of Norway maples that get a lot of tar spot. It suppresses this. You see really good suppression because you see higher defense compounds. And then the one thing I do want to note here too is that paclobutrazol is technically in the triazole family, so it is technically it's in a fungicide sort of family. So originally it was trying to be developed as a fungicide, as a soil applied fungicide, and they found out as a secondary thing that it was really just like making trees smaller or grow less, or not smaller, but grow less. So they were like, oh, okay, this isn't doing what we want necessarily from a full fungicide side, but there's this other benefit, which is why it got developed the way that it did. But in turn ends up having fungicidal qualities on something like this, as well as crabapple or apple scab, and even like powdery mildew, any of your foliar leaf funguses, which in your drier areas, I don't know where everyone is from on this call, but in your drier areas, foliar leaf diseases and needle diseases are super prevalent. And as climate changes and it gets wetter, it will become more of an issue. In your drier climates, it's not as big of an issue though. But if it is, this could be a tool. Bacterial leaf scorch. Again, this, I think I should have put this with the other scorches and dryness things, but you see we've got good control there. And then what I do want to talk about, perfect timing, treating trees in decline. So this is an interesting case study. This is over at the Morton Arboretum, really close to where I used to live. And they started this study, around when some of us were very small children. Anyway, so this tree on the left was a white oak. They call this the Lazarus oak. So basically, I would never treat this tree. That tree on the left would be a removal, in my opinion. But in the name of science, they wanted to try this. So they aided this whole tree using paclobutrazol application every 3 years. They did air tool work to alleviate soil compaction. They did a bunch of deadwood pruning, and they just used the whole toolbox approach. The one thing they did not do is mulch, which is shocking and confusing, but whatever. But I literally saw this tree last year on this campus and it looks great and it's still alive. So it's pretty alarming that 30 years later, you see this tree on the left that you honestly would have thought was a goner and we're able to bring that back. So again, it does have great qualities. Don't use it on a tree that bad. Your clients will be really unhappy unless you're doing it as an experiment. But for trees that are, less than 25% canopy dieback, it could have good, good impacts, especially when you're talking about like Mrs. Smith's prized fill in the blank tree, could be a great option. Application on trees, your soil injection, your basal drench. For your shrubs, foliar application. So precautions, this is my last slide. But precautions using this, you need to use the correct treatment rates and make proper reductions per the label. Like I said, I love to do in-field training. So if this is something you'd ever consider using, I'd love to come out and meet with you and do some applications. overregulation potential. So there are some species, and that's later a point, some species that are too sensitive to treat because basically you overregulate them to the point where they die. Their leaves become like so small that they can't even photosynthesize. But there is overregulation potential even in trees that are not sensitive. So like a tree like that has really big leaves naturally. So let's just go back to like our sugar maple or Norway maple. If you overregulate those and then the trees go from being the size of your face to the size of like, you know, a quarter, you're going to have some alarmed clients. So just being aware of that. It may increase flower and blooming in fruits. So that's just something to consider because obviously like with folks who have like crab apples and things that really don't like the excess amount of fruits, you may not want to recommend it. Runoff can be an issue. So you need to make sure that you keep it close to the base of the tree and be careful of your non-target species and turf. You will kill turf if it gets off of the area that you're trying to treat. And non-target species, I wish I had a picture of this, but like the first, I treated this tree that had a bunch of tulips around it, and the first row of tulips immediately around the tree, they're like 6 inches tall versus the regular tulips that are like a foot tall. It's not a cure-all. Some trees are not candidates, so like ones that are too far gone. Some trees are too sensitive, as I just said. And you do need to understand what the product does, its limitations, and if specific trees would benefit or not. And this is definitely best used as part of an IPM and plant